All right, here's our video today. The Black Death, the science of the Black Death, the science behind the Black Death, a devastating pandemic that struck Europe in the 14th century, mid 14th century. So let me write the times down. And I'm not calling it the bubonic plague because actually the Black Death had three plagues in it. We'll talk about those three plagues. And of course, people either got one or two, or they got all of them. So I'll make sure my pen's working. So we're looking at a time in the 14th century, peaking around 1347 to about 1351, roughly around those dates. And I said there were three plagues. That's why we call it the Black Death, because there was the most famous, of course, is the bubonic plague. There was also the septicemic plague. And of course, it was the pneumonic plague. And so bubonic, septicemic, pneumonic. And with the bubonic plague is the one where they had those swollen lymph nodes. And I'll show you that. And they're called buboes. That's why it's bubonic plague. And they typically appear sometimes under the armpit, the neck. With the septicemic plague, though, it's just blood poisoning. It's getting sepsis. And that's where the bacteria gets into the blood. And some say that the worst was actually the pneumonic plague because of how highly contagious it is. And it affects the lungs and could lead to severe respiratory illness. So let's look at the three plagues that were called the Black Death. There's a clearer vision of it. So all this was caused by a bacteria. And the bacteria, and it's still around, this bacteria, by the way, but we have antibiotics today to cure it, especially if it's caught early. But the bacteria is Yersinia pestis. So it's caused by a bacteria. And of course, as it was transmitted through trade routes, came in by a flea that were on rats. Simple as that. So some people were bitten by the flea and they got these symptoms. So again, like I said, with bubonic plague, they have these nodes, these swollen lymph nodes, and we'll just put an arrow down here. Lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are important for us now. They're part of our immune system. So when you have these swollen lymph nodes under the armpit and so forth, you would get infected by the bacteria, Yersinia pestis. And what happened is, no matter where you were bitten in the bloodstream, the bacteria will just flow through into the lymph nodes and they will get swollen. And again, the symptoms, of course, would be fever, chills, and weakness. And these buboes, which are these, of course, these swollen. Let's get a little picture of that if we can. So there's a picture of a buboes. So again, with the bubonic plague, they have these swollen, they have this, right? These swollen swollen and painful. So we're talking about painful lymph nodes. And again, the lymph nodes are important for our immune system. So when a flea bites, the transmission would be a flea bites the animal, or the human, in this case the humans, and then the symptoms will be fever and chills and weakness, and again, the buboes that are occurring. And the other plague we said, which of course some people this would lead to, because it leads to sepsis when the bacteria grow. Put it up here. Septicemic plague, and just basically sepsis. It's basically blood poisoning. And when the bacteria go get out of control, and we'll talk about that because they hide themselves from the specific bacteria, Yersinia pestis hides from white blood cells, and we'll talk about how they do that. So again, basically, blood poisoning. Spell that right. Blood poisoning. Or, like this, sepsis. And with septicemic plague, again, the same symptoms, fevers and chills. You usually have shock sometimes because of the sepsis, which could lead to internal bleeding, bruising, and death. And then the other one is pneumonic. Again, all three of these is the Black Death. Pneumonic plague. And again, this affects the lungs, which leads to severe respiratory illness. And the pneumonic plague is probably the most dangerous because it could be transferred more easily in the population. And you get coughs and chest pain, difficulty breathing. And here's a picture. It's a little blurry of all the lymph nodes we have in our body. Again, they're these small bean-shaped structures that are part of our lymphatic system. Of course, again, we said it's a major role in our immune system. So the bacteria would flow into these lymph nodes and cause severe swelling and pain. And if we think about the mortality rate in Europe at the time, we're talking 25 to 30 million people in Europe, which is about, they're approximating, probably 1/3, some people even say 1/2 of the population were killed because of this. That it's extraordinary if you think about it. If we put it in perspective, we think about in population in the U.S. today, it's over 300 million, let's say 333 million people. And just think if it happened and we didn't have antibiotics or solutions for it, just think about 1/3 of that, 1/3 of 333 million, you're at 111 million people. Imagine that, just to give you a little perspective. How many people were dead, and you can imagine the economic and social impact on the Black Death. Let me clear that out. Find it somewhere. Clear all. And we'll go back to, again, just talking about some of the science behind sepsis. So the bacterium, Yersinia pestis, remember, so it enters the blood, it could enter the bloodstream from those buboes, right? Those, as you saw in the picture, those little welts, right? Those infections through the lymph nodes, the swollen lymph nodes. And once the bacteria enters the blood, that's where you can lead to organ failure and death if not treated promptly. And of course, it wasn't treated promptly in the 1300s. It could lead to tissue damage, and also it could lead to an immune response where the body overreacts. It could be leading to another shock. A hyperactive response can cause widespread inflammation, shock, and organ failure with sepsis. So the bacteria, once it enters the body, it's usually carried through the lymphatic vessels to the lymph nodes, the nearest lymph nodes, and there they can multiply and they can trigger an immune response. Now the white blood cells specifically are, they target these pathogens. But what the Yersinia pestis has done, it's evolved a way to evade that. Let's talk about that. So when this enters the body, when the bacteria enters the body, it could block, receptor activation. Receptor activation. Activation, that is. Receptor activation. And basically, just in a simple term, the bacteria, I'll write it over here. The bacteria will inject proteins, and these are the proteins that help it evade, into the immune cells. It's adapted this into the immune cells. And they stop, what they can do? They stop the immune cells' detection proteins from working properly. So basically, they're just knocking down the system so the white blood cells can't recognize them. Simple as that. The white blood cells, the neutrophils, the macrophages, they can't recognize this protein. They can't recognize the bacteria and so the bacteria could spread much more quickly. The white blood cells still do a good enough job at attacking them, though. But for every one they eat, 5 more reproduce, in a sense. So that's the science behind the Black Death.